Welcome everyone, post-spring break. Good to see you here. Next week we're going to have someone internal to UT, Dr. Todd Davidson, talk about whether you should drive on Uber or not, depending on how much it costs and if you want to incorporate externalities into driving a car or owning your own car or taking the Uber service. So to Uber or not to Uber, which he has written an article and paper with roughly that title, will also be the talk for next week. So this week we have Garvin Boyle, who I have met through several conferences over the last few years with a group of people that like to, I'd say, try to think differently about how energy and resources fit into the economy and try to think about different ways in which how the economic system organizes itself, how we understand patterns in the economy, maybe with a, what we might, is generally called a heterodox approach, which is basically not homodox, I guess. But not mainstream. So he has econodynamics here. There's all kinds of ideas that he thinks about. Some people call these econophysics, econodynamics, various ideas. But what he's done a lot of interesting things in agent-based modeling to try to understand basic interactions of people, say in a agrarian type society, and try to understand some just really sort of fundamental modeling that I think is really interesting. So that's why I invited him here, because I think it's pretty insightful and I learned from what he does. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to bring him here. So he's going to give a little bit more introduction on his background, better than I can do, so I will pass it over to Garvin now. So Garvin, thanks for coming.
Push this now.
I think it's green now. Yeah, you're good. You're on.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to talk about a framework for rebooting the study of economics. I think my presentation will be perhaps a bit whimsical, you might think. Certainly it'll be somewhat philosophical. Let me tell you a bit more about who I am. I have over 25 years of experience in the Canadian federal government and in the private sector as an information technology project manager running multi-million-dollar projects. I also have about 10 years of experience teaching mathematics and science at the high school level. I think this is a rather unusual combination of kinds of experience. And I tutor business mathematics at the MBA level at a local university. Little more to the point, I have over 50 years of experience building models of dynamic systems. When I was 17 years old, I built my first model. It was of a billiards table. I was trying to understand elastic and inelastic collisions. But building dynamic models on computers has been my hobby ever since. And this is important because about 8 years ago when I retired, I sat down and thought about what I wanted to do in my retirement, play golf, curling, something like that. And I decided I wanted to understand economics. Now, I had been using economics for my entire career in the government, and I just couldn't believe what I was doing. So I thought, I'll take my hobby and put it to good use. So for the past 8 years, I've been building models and studying them, trying to find the necessary and sufficient conditions for a modern, fully technological society like the one we enjoy at the moment to be sustainable in the long term. So I have about 8 models after 8 years. That's pretty good, I think. So my agenda is going to be, I'm going to talk a bit about orthodox economic theory and how that might be viewed through the eyes of Thomas Kuhn. I'm going to present the proposed framework in 4 parts. And then I've got a couple of slides on the need for a new economic paradigm. Let's jump into it. NCE, it stands for Neoclassical Economics. Now, in fact, it's a number of different kinds of economics have succeeded one another, but we tend to lump them all together and call them Neoclassical Economics. It is now the world's dominant economic theory. I estimate that it is taught in over 20,000 colleges and universities around the world who are churning out new, fresh young people just learn their trade out there to get into the business world. It's used by almost all government leaders and all corporate leaders around the world. and it is an extremely powerful economic theory. Here we have a graph along the bottom. You see from the year 1000 up to 2050, and up the side is the population in billions. The green line is where we are today, and neoclassical economic theory started to appear somewhere in the mid-1800s and coalesced around 1900. And just look at the growth that it has created in the world. It has to be a powerful theory. Good theory causes growth. This is what we hear from the TV. I mean, it's implied at least from the TV and the radio and the newspapers all the time. If we could just take our model and tweak it a little bit, just adjust the rate of taxes, adjust the rate of interest, do some kind of tweaking with our model, we'll get back to strong growth. Well, I think that's the great modern myth. Good economic theory causes growth. Correlation does not imply causation. And I think it's an equally valid hypothesis to say growth caused NCE to become the dominant economic theory of our age. Now, my own personal theory is not quite that, but it's similar to that, and you'll see that a little bit later on. Now, I want to talk about Thomas Kuhn. He was an eminent historian of scientific theory, very tight focus in this historian's studies. He did his most important thinking during the 50s and early 60s when scientists around the world were grappling with the question, how does science advance? It was a very philosophical question. There were a number of scientists that said, well, empiricism is the most important thing. The data that comes to you through your senses, your eyes, your nose, your ears, your fingers, this is what science is all about. And they were called the positivists. Then among them, there were a group that said, yes, you put forward a theory and then you try to verify it. And then there was another group that said, no, 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 you put forward a theory and then you try to falsify it. And they were having a very interesting discussion. And Thomas Kuhn stood back and he said, wait a minute, people. You're talking about how you think science advances and how you want science to be done and how you think it should be done. But we've got 600 years of history here of science actually being done and advancing. So why don't we stand back and look at what really happens? So in 1962, he published this essay, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and if you haven't read it, you really should read it. If you've ever heard of a paradigm shift, and who hasn't, he's the guy who thought up the idea. But it's not as trivial as many people make it sound. It's a very profound essay. And this is the dynamic that he's proposing. At the beginning, a new dominant paradigm replaces the old. So before Galileo, Aristotelian mechanics dominated everybody's view of how the world works. Aristotelian mechanics is very teleological in its nature. Basically, he says, things do what they do because that's what they're supposed to do. Things fall because they're made to fall, right? Then along came Newton in particular, and he published his Principia, and everybody thought, gee, that's a different way of looking at it. A totally different way of looking at it. And pretty soon, people abandoned Aristotle and started taking Newton's point of view, and Aristotle was kind of shouldered off the stage, and then Newtonian mechanics was left there. Then he said normal science ensues. Once you've got a paradigm that's dominant, then people start thinking, now what does this tell me about the world? Well, here's something I don't understand. So they apply the paradigm and they try to figure it out. And every now and then there's something they can't figure out, so they put it on the table behind them. Then a bit later they drag it out and they work on it some more. Ooh, sometimes they figure it out, but some things are just too difficult to figure out using that paradigm. When the pile of stuff on the table behind them gets too big, then science goes into a critical stage, the yellow stage here. Too many critical anomalies not resolved. Response to the crisis is the emergence of novel theories that challenge the paradigm. You start having thinkers appear who everybody thinks they're crazy, right? But they say, it's not crazy, it's just a different way of looking at the world. Maybe you should consider it. Eventually, a number of those ideas come together and a new paradigm is born. Then you get into revolution. And that's when somebody's getting shouldered off the stage, right? The new paradigm gathers people who support it, and the old one, people depart. And then you start the cycle all over again. So I think if Thomas Kuhn was looking at modern economic theory, he would say that we're in the yellow area. There are a lot of new novel theories coming out, and they're swirling around. If you do a search of Google on the internet and look for heterodox economics, you get somewhere between 30 and 40 different groups of organized academics who think neoclassical economics theory is wrong, either in whole or in part. Now, these four in particular are the ones that I like, and I've read into their literature quite a bit in the past 8 years. Charles Hall is organizing biophysical economics. Herman Daly, he was the founder of ecological economics. Yakovenko is not the founder of econophysics, but he's certainly the one whose work I've read most assiduously, and quite a bit of my own modeling is based on his work. Complexity economics, the name associated that with is Arthur. That comes out of the Santa Fe Institute, I believe. I've done less reading there, but I know about what they're doing. So we've got these new competing theories coming around. This is why I think we are in what Thomas Kuhn would be considering crisis science. We need a new way to see our global economy. Do you see that word see? Well, I'm not sure that it's actually see. We need to think about a new way. We need to tell ourselves a new story. Let me try to help you understand what a paradigm shift is. What do you see up here? I'll give you just a few seconds to think about. What do you see? So I see 3 Pac-Men and 3 angles, maybe capital V's or something like that. Does anybody dispute that? No. So if I do this, what do you see now? It's the same thing. Now we could argue, no, there's no triangles up there. It's just 3 Pac-Man and 3 angles. Or maybe there's 1 triangle, or maybe there's 2 triangles. I showed it to my wife and she said, oh, there's 6, of course. There's a story in your head. You want to see it again? That's the story in your head that tells you how it got to be that way, and that informs the way you interpret your senses. But let me show you a different story. Now, I can argue definitely it's 3 circles and 2 triangles, right? 3 circles, 2 triangles. The story that we have in our head changes the way we see the world, and that's what a paradigm shift is. You don't have to have all the details of the paradigm worked out. You just need to shift your point of view, and suddenly you see things differently. Suddenly you're able to take that pile of stuff on the back table that couldn't be explained before, and oh, it's simple, right? Maybe you can't explain some of the stuff that you used to be able to understand, but it's different. So I decided I would take a Gestalt approach. We study chemistry, we study physics, we study sociology. These are all separate studies, but we don't live in 9 different worlds. We live in one world. There's one reality, one physical system, one chemical system, one global society, many cultures, but one global society, and one global economy. So my assumption is the same fundamental stochastic processes that shape our physical, chemical, and biological reality also shape our social and economic reality. Why would they be different? If those processes are so potent in shaping our physical reality, wouldn't they also potentially shape our social reality? Stochastic means random, if you don't like the word stochastic. So, over the past 8 years, while I've been building my 8 models and studying them and trying to put them together, In the back of my mind, like a jigsaw puzzle, I've been thinking, well, how does this fit together with that? And it's changed a lot of times. But about a year ago, a friend of mine said, so what is really your framework that this all fits into? And I thought, well, gee, I don't know if I have a framework. I sat down, started thinking about it, and I came up with something. This isn't it, by the way. This is version 2 of my framework, and is probably not the last version of the framework. And I call it an econodynamics framework because I needed a word. I needed to call it something and didn't want to insult anybody, so I found a word that I thought nobody was using, and I put it up there. Right? So everything is temporary, everything is in flux. Now, as I'm explaining this, I'm going to say some things that some of you probably won't believe. In fact, some of you might find some of my statements outrageous. And that would not be a bad thing. But what I ask you to do is to set aside your disbelief for a while and try to think, what are the fundamental stochastic processes that he sees in this that might make this make sense? Right? What are the invisible triangles that he is now thinking that he's seeing, perhaps delusionally, but that he thinks he's seeing, that he's trying to get across? Just for the rest of my presentation. So we're going to start with the effects of recursion. Simple recursive stochastic processes, that means random processes, can generate complex structures. They don't have to, but they just can. So what I'm thinking about when I say recursion is something that repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. A little bit different every time, probably, but there's just that endless repetition. So it's a part of every aspect of our life. When we're in school, we're taught that that time is linear, that it starts over here in a straight line. A year goes by, 2 years go by, 3 years go by. But that's not, that might be true objectively, but subjectively, we experience it as cycles. Breathing, eating, waste elimination, daily cycles, annual, generational cycles. And it's a part of every aspect of economic activity, buying, selling, building, whatever. When a man goes into business, or a woman, I guess, that was politically incorrect. When a entrepreneur goes into business, they don't decide, well, I think on day 1, I'm going to make some soap and try to sell it. And on day 2, I'm going to make some toy soldiers and paint them and try to sell those. And on day 3, maybe I'll try to write an opera and sell that. It's not like that. When they go into business, they're expecting monotony, the same thing again and again. And in fact, in the monotony of doing things over and over again, you get better and better. Your soap gets better and better, and you sell it better and better. It's part of the very fabric of economic activity. My next point is recursion is creative. Incrementally, little by little, recursion is creative. And quite possibly accidentally as well. You can accidentally make something better. You can accidentally make something a lot worse. Examples. Now, I could talk for an hour on any one of these and still not exhaust the topic, but I'm just going to give it a few minutes. Fractal geometry and fractal structures. What is a fractal? A fractal is a geometric shape that is similar to itself at some other scale. So for example, a tree is a fractal. A tree is similar to the structure of a branch, which is similar to the structure of a twig. So you've got 3 different scales there, and it's similar to itself at all those scales. Where do we find self-similar fractals? Well, geometry before the 1980s was fundamentally Euclidean geometry. Euclid described things as flat planes, circles, squares, triangles, lines, that sort of thing. It's the kind of geometry that everybody learned in high school, way back when I was going through high school. So where do we find these self-similar fractals? Well, Benoit Mandelbrot published a book in 1982 that changed my life. It's a very dense book. It's hard to read, but it's got beautiful pictures in it. And some quite astounding things happening in it. He argued that when you look at the surface of a desk, it looks flat, it looks like it's Euclidean geometry, but if you look at it really closely, it's kind of bumpy. You know, if you put a microscope on it, it would be bumpy. And how do you describe that kind of surface? And he discovered that since about 1900, a variety of mathematicians had come up with strange curves that they didn't know how to classify. He put them all together and discovered that they were all fractal in nature. So where do we find these self-similar fractals? Everywhere. Now the ones I'm going to show you are special cases in the sense that their fractal nature is very obvious. The fractal nature of the chair you're sitting on might not be terribly obvious to you, but it's there because those are stochastic fractals, whereas the ones I'm going to show you are less than stochastic. First one, segmented self-similar curve. Also called the paper folding curve. I'm going to have to put this down for a sec. If you take any piece of paper, I think this is incredible. Take any piece of paper and fold it, and then open it up to right angles, you have a dragon. There's his head, there's his tail, and here's his two little feet. You have to use your imagination, right? So you fold it a second time and open it up so that it's at right angles. Oh, I got him backwards. There we are. There's his head, there's his tail, and there's his two little feet. Right? So you fold it again and again and again. It's hard to do that with a piece of paper. Believe me, I've tried. Here's the piece of paper, that line. There we folded it once and opened it up to 90 degrees. There I folded it twice. You can see the head, the tail, and the two little feet. Now I'm going to clip the corners off because I like a nice sinewy line. So when I clip the corners off and do the next fold, it looks like that. 8, 9, 10. There's 10 folds. This is called a dragon curve, or the Harder Highway dragon curve. There's something fantastic about this curve. If you think about tiling your kitchen, my wife won't let me do this, by the way. If you think about tiling your kitchen, you usually get square tiles, and they fit together side by side, top to bottom, and no part of the underfloor shows through. Or you could use triangles. They can tile the floor as well. Well, you could tile the floor with these things. They fit together back to back, belly to belly, front to back, side to side. Any way you want to put them together, you can form a pattern that would completely cover your kitchen floor. Isn't that a cool idea? So there, for example, is 2 order 10 dragons back to back. The blue one, you can't see it quite so clearly, and the purple one on top. I've just attached the heads together and attached the tails together when they're back to back. So that's a very simple fractal that's with us all the time. Here's Romanesco broccoli. You see that the big cone is made of mid-sized cones, and each one of those is made of a little cone. Here's a river through the San Francisco Bay salt flats. You've got the big river, you've got a medium-sized river and little tributaries off of it. Something a little more stochastic. These are the glaciers in the Himalayan mountains. These are the veins in a leaf. These are the small canyons on the Grand Canyon. This is the path that lightning flows as a lightning strike goes from a ground up into the clouds. This is the gross national product of the USA between 1950 and 2010. Now this one is a stochastic fractal. You say, well, that doesn't look self-similar at all. But the reality is that if you take something like this, financial data, and you measure it for a month and make a plot, measure it for a year, measure it for 10 years, measure it for 50 years, and you take all the numbers off and you show it to somebody who's naive, somebody who hasn't memorized the gross national product for the past 50 years, for example. You show it to a naive person, and they can't tell the difference between 1 month's worth of data and 50 years worth of data. It's similar in shape, similar in structure. Now notice this isn't the gross national product. This is the percent change. And the change is fractal in nature. So my first speculative observation, time and recursion are the source of all complexity. Now, that's a bit of a brash statement. All complexity that you find everywhere in the world, time and recursion caused it to happen. My next box. I ask you to please set aside your doubts for a while. My next box, conservation effects, invariance under recursion, stable platforms. Some things are absolutely conserved and some things are merely sufficiently well conserved. I'm going to talk about energy and money because I think those two are very, very similar in the way they affect our modern society, especially since 1971. So what is a conservation law? There are lots and lots of them, surprisingly. For a dynamic system, we can measure some characteristic number, and when other things are changing under recursion, this number does not change. Now, we have to be careful about how we define the system. We have to be sure that energy is not leaking in or leaking out, or we have to keep track of it. So we don't just wave our hands and it happens. But if you're very careful about how you measure things, the total amount of energy in a system does not change as the recursion cycle carries on time after time. Same with modern money in the modern world. The total amount of money, for the most part, does not change as we go through cycles. And I'll explain that one in a little while. But that's what a conservation law is. Just something is conserved. Some measure of the system, some value of the system doesn't change when other things are changing. So when Newton published his Principia, he did not know that all of these things were conserved. He had some idea that something strange existed. It was called vis viva back in those days, but they didn't understand energy at all. He was thinking that maybe something like mv was conserved. They didn't have a word for momentum either. Certainly he didn't talk about angular momentum. All of these conservation laws were implicit in his Principia and implicit in the Newtonian paradigm when he established it. But he didn't talk about them, right? So what is the conservation law of energy? I say he didn't know about it. It took very smart people over 250 years to figure it out. I understand that Fermi, somebody who worked in quantum physics, put the last little point on the conservation of energy law in 1948. That was a long time after Newton started the ball rolling. But the cosmologists have discovered dark energy now, and all of a sudden the scales don't balance anymore. So they've got to go back to the books and try to invent some new calculations to make sure the balance is kept. So there we have it. Total energy. What is the conservation law? This is the first law of thermodynamics now. Total energy never changes. The value does not change. Energy is, in a very real sense, very much like an accounting system in which the ledgers always balance. They make sure that you've got the right conversion factors all the time so that it balances. If it doesn't balance, well, they go back and look at the conversion factors and try to make them balance. Try to find, that's the paradigm, right? That's what they're always trying to figure out, and so far they've succeeded. For example, in the original version of Newtonian mechanics, mass was considered to be an exact conservation law. Along came Einstein with his E equals mc squared, and suddenly mass isn't conserved. Well, it's kind of conserved. Einstein wasn't saying, oh, well, you can just take any old set of molecules and stir them up and they'll all turn into oxygen or turn into gold. I guess that would be better. The conservation laws around mass are still very, very solid, but there's a little possibility of leakage. So it's a partial conservation law. Then in quantum mechanics, we've got lots of partial conservation laws. Things are sufficiently well conserved to be of interest. What I find interesting is if we consider these things to be sufficiently well conserved to somehow be a platform on which complex organisms, complex structures can appear in the world, then we start to bring together physics and sociology and economics. Genes are conserved. I have about 3 trillion genes in my body. They all came from a single sperm and an egg when those came together. And yet most of my genes are copied pretty well true, right? So are they sufficiently well preserved for biological systems to produce a great variety of species? They are. So I think the conservation laws should include this. I want to talk about money. The earliest money was debt. Way back when, they used to make little bottles, and with cuneiform things they would write the name of the person who owed the money and how much he owed, and they'd drop it into a bottle, and I guess when it was all paid off they'd smash the bottle because there were lots of these broken bottles found. Then along came commodity money. First it was cows and knives and shells and obsidian tools. And then later on, for the more advanced civilizations, it was gold, silver, and copper coins. But if you've ever tried to carry a lot of gold around in your pocket, so they have representative money where a piece of paper represents, no, it used to represent gold. It used to actually be able to go into the tinsmith and say, I have a certificate that says you're holding my gold, and he'd turn over the gold. Then we had this thing called fiat money. Here's an example of fiat money. Fiat money is really strange because it's not worth anything. Piece of plastic paper, right? If you saw a piece of plastic like that on the ground, you'd boot it out of the road. Or maybe you wouldn't even bother, right? Our ocean is full of this kind of stuff. But as long as we share the delusion that this is valuable, we can run an economy on it, right? If you and I believe that it has the same value, well, I'm Canadian and you're American. Won't work. All right, it's no good. It's good to me. So then something happened in 1971. All that other stuff disappeared, and all we've got is this delusional money. What happened in 1971? Several things. The oil production in continental United States peaked and started to go down. The United States decided that it could no longer keep its money tagged to gold, so although it had already abandoned the gold standard, in fact, in the 1920s, it finally told the world, all right, that's it, we give up, we're not connected to gold anymore. But more importantly, I think the banks started transferring money using electronic funds transfer. One of my first jobs as a programmer was to work on the customer side of an EFT project for banks sending money to the government. So when that happened, modern money that had been forming for some time took flight. It broke free from its cocoon, and like a moth, it took flight. When that happened, it changed the world. It was a paradigm shift for the world. I argue that modern money is fundamentally different from all that existed prior to 1971. Modern money in particular is conserved, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. It can be viewed as simply an accounting system in which ledgers always balance, which makes it very similar to energy. It forms the stable platform on which all the complexity of modern financial systems thrive and grow. So this is one of the models. I wish I could show you all of my models, but I don't have the time for that. This is one that I will show you. This is the conservation of money laboratory. You see, this is the money supply. At the top is the little bit of coins and bills that the government created without having to go to the bank. Then we have the green part is the bank loans, and the purple part is the bank debt. Now this is the way modern money is created. Suppose I'm a banker and I don't have any money, and you want to borrow $1 million from me. No problem. I just take $1 million and I put it into your bank account, and you give me $1 million IOU. My net worth has not changed. I'm down $1 million, up $1 million. Your net worth has not changed. You're up $1 million, down $1 million. So the net worth has not changed. But there's $1 million more of the green stuff in the world and $1 million more of the purple stuff in the world. And if you add it all up, the total amount of money is still zero. So money has been conserved. But like a proton and an antiproton being created out of nothing, we've got this money and this anti-money. The positive money tends to migrate through society slowly as recursion happens, and it migrates towards the big positive banks of money, the pension funds, of which I hold a chunk, the war chests of the big corporations, that kind of stuff. And the negative money migrates towards the people who hold the debt, migrates towards the sovereign debt mountains. So that's how money is created, and that's why I believe it's conserved. It's conserved using double entry bookkeeping that was invented back about 1300 near Venice, I believe. And it's managed using fractional reserve banking that was invented in the States and in Britain around the mid-1800s, I believe. So let's look at what happens if you put double entry bookkeeping, fractional reserve banking, and conservation of money into a little model and let it run for a while. At the beginning, the green is the people and the red is the banks. I decided the banks start with nothing. They have the ability to make money, but they have to make, positive and negative. And I gave the people a dollop of money at the beginning. That's the little yellow thing at the top of my money supply chart. And then you run it for a while, and whoa, boy, the economy is really doing well. Whenever people run out of money, they just go to the bank and get a little more. Now, they have to pay some interest on it, but all the money you need is available. Every time you need it, you just go to the bank and get some. Unless you're going bankrupt, of course, in which case the bank cuts you off and you die and disappear. So the economy is doing great. Look at the banks. Oh, some of the banks are starting to make a bit of a profit, and some of them are not doing so well. But they're small players, really. And you run it a little bit longer. Now, I haven't gotten to equilibrium yet. I'm about halfway there. The banks have a great deal of money now, and the people, well, about half of them are deeply in debt, and the other half are not. And if you run it to equilibrium, that peak moves closer and closer and closer down into debt until people are fighting with bankruptcy all the time. So a few lessons learned from this kind of a model. Banks have two roles with conflicting goals: public trust, creation of money; private interest, earn a profit. And this is built right into the way banks function, and I don't think that's a good idea. At steady state, if you let it run to steady state, eventually, steady state means nothing is getting bigger and nothing is getting smaller, right? So the amount of money going from the people to the banks as interest payments has to be offset by some flow of money from the banks back to the people. Otherwise, you don't have steady state. So you look at what are the channels for money to flow, and it happens that in my model, those channels were the banks paying wages, which was minimal, almost nothing. The banks being taxed by the government, and bankruptcies. So how do you understand banks giving away money for bankruptcies? Well, no bank ever says, hey, that guy's going to go bust. I'll loan him $1 million. You think, that guy's going to do well. I'll loan him $1 million, and he goes bust. And the banks has to take the loss. So that's the flow of money from the banks back to the people. Flows between banking and non-banking sectors can and must be managed. Not necessarily the way I manage it in the model, but you can't let the economy run the way that I showed you and still be sustainable for the long term into the future. Government tax and spend redistributes the wealth. That's what I do in my model. That's not necessarily the only answer, but that's not necessarily a bad thing based on the model that I've got here. So what are the effects of conservation laws? Let's rise up to a higher plane now. What are the effects of conservation laws? Well, they're an effective constraint on the products of recursion. When recursion is happily going along and occasionally something complex pops out, that can only happen if it's within the rules, the conservation rules. So there are lots of conservation laws that prevent lots of things happening. If you're looking for a molecule of water to appear, you have to start with oxygen and hydrogen, right? You can't start with carbon and sulfur. So the conservation laws of mass must be obeyed. Only those things that are in agreement with all of those conservation laws can happen actually. So it's a constraint, a great constraint on the products of recursion. But once something has happened, those same rules that prevented it from coming into being kind of prevent it from going away, at least for a while. And so what that does, that conservation law becomes a stable platform for increased complexity, because now it's possible for something more complex to just accidentally happen when you've got something that's already pretty complex, right? If you've got no complexity, you can't expect it to suddenly randomly produce great complexity. But if it's just a little incremental jump, that's a possibility. So conservation laws kind of hold those complex products around for long enough for something accidental to make it a little bit better. This does not explain persistence yet, but it's a step in that direction. So my second speculative observation, conservation laws are the stable platforms on which all complex forms arise. Looking at my third box, entropy production effects. Now, there are possibly many kinds of entropy that I think I could talk about. If you look in the literature, thermodynamic entropy and informational entropy is what everybody is what everybody talks about. I'm going to talk about thermodynamic and money. So thermodynamic entropy, a man by the name of Clausius was working with bottles of gas and liquid, and when he was mixing them and putting them in contact, he found that this ratio of heat over temperature never seemed to go down, it always went up. So a lot of people thinking about that for several decades decided that this was the second law of thermodynamics, and they said the entropy of the universe always rises. As entropy rises, things degrade. So I can put together a formula like this. We've got the thermodynamic entropy of the universe now. We've got the maximum possible thermodynamic entropy, and we'll call that the entropic index. One, take away the entropic index, is what I'm calling the grade. So what does that look like? The grade of the universe starts really high, and it's the little red button there going down as the entropic index goes up. I can show you that one more time. The grade of the universe goes down, the entropic index of the universe goes up. Rising thermodynamic entropy is closely associated with decay, declining value, and advancing corruption. So in modern economic theory, thermodynamic entropy appears trivially, I think, as depreciation. But entropy is much more important than that. In my models, I've come up with something called, that I'm calling economic entropy. Actually, I got it from Viktor Yakovenko, and I'm just trying to figure out how it works. And it's the ability of an economy to autonomously alter the distribution of wealth. Economic entropy seeks some kind of equilibrium value with the appropriate distribution of wealth associated with that. So again, I've got the same kind of expression here, and you see the blue mark down at the bottom. That's the way the economy is organized predetermines the level of entropy that it's going to seek. So the monetary entropy rose until it got to that blue point. If you start it higher, it falls. If you start it lower, it rises. Entropy is more important than just depreciation. Economic entropy is the main culprit in the age-old unjust distributions of wealth. Now, Yakovenko, when he did his models, he figured out that it's a stupidly simple model, actually, incredibly simple, but he always got this distribution of wealth. Well, that is the distribution of wealth that has plagued civilization for at least 5,000 years. You always have a small number of people who are very wealthy, and the vast majority of the population are poor. This is after the civilization has existed for a while. So he wanted to know if this was true. He went out and he checked U.S. income tax statistics, and he got a very close fit to the model, especially in the middle. At the bottom and the top ends, the fit is different, but in the middle, his model predicts it very accurately. So I took my model, and that blue arc is the level of entropy that I expect it to rise to. And I changed Yakovenko's model slightly. And when I did the first one, rats. Same unjust distribution of wealth, the thing that we don't like at all. I put a little more money into the model, and oh, that's a lot better. We've got a number of wealthy people, a number of poor people, a number of people right in the middle. I changed the amount of money again, and whoa. Now that's the utopia that people have been talking about for 1,000 years or more, where most people are reasonably well off and very few are poor. So time and rising entropy are the great destroyers of complexity. Looking at the fourth box, this is a tricky one. I'm going to try to address it in 3 steps quickly. We're going to talk about the overarching role of natural selection, and that gets us into the Darwin's theory of evolution. It's usually described in 4 parts. The first 3 have to do with recursion and conservation. This fourth one, nobody really knows where to put it. There's a lot of work being done over the past 40 years on just exactly what happens, what makes complexity happen, and how does it hang around. So Lotka published 2 very interesting papers in 1922. The first one, Principle of Persistence of Stable Forms, is just Darwin's natural selection renamed. And it's an umbrella concept. Now, what we're talking about here is we have some kind of fitness criteria, and natural selection chooses things for persistence. And then over here we have those things that persist. Now, when he made this argument, he was drawing it from biological basis, but he believed, as did Boltzmann and Darwin before him, that it could also be applied to economics. So then his second paper, the principle of maximum degradation of energy. I've renamed it. He called it the principle of maximum flux, but I've renamed it because I want to put it in opposition to another idea. So where does it go in this diagram? It's one of the universal fitness criteria, and he said Darwin talked about species, but he wanted to talk about energy pathways. Now, to understand energy pathways, we have to understand energy transformation, so I'm going to do a quick diagram here. Whenever you transform energy, you've got energy inputs, then you do something, and you've got useful energy going to the next store, but some energy is wasted along the way. Lotka was talking about this waste energy when he put forward his opinions. So here we have an economic supply chain. He was talking about energy pathways that went from side to side in the system. So we have energy coming in from the sun and zooming through this supply chain. And his argument was that those supply chains, those pathways that collect the most energy and burn it all off, will dominate the ones that collect less or fail to burn it off. Now, think about this in business terms. The company with the most oil wells is likely going to grow in size, and a small company with a few oil wells, assuming the oil wells are all the same quality, is probably not going to grow as fast and will be pushed aside and eventually become bankrupt or be bought up. So those supply chains that collect the most energy and burn it off are selected for persistence over their contemporary supply chains. That's what he's talking about. So what are the implications of this? Some complex processes and structures are selected for persistence due to higher consumption. According to Lotka, this is a universal fitness criteria for all energy pathways everywhere. This explains the persistence of complex structures. More complex systems require more power. Selection for power is like selection for complexity. Maximum preservation of energy. Now this is Odom's idea. He called it the maximum power principle, and I still leave that title on it, but his concept of it I prefer to call the principle of maximum preservation energy, to put it in antithesis of Lotka's concept. And it goes right here. And he's talking about energy transformation mechanisms, not species, like Darwin. So we could also apply it to social memes and national and global economies. His interest is in this part of the diagram. Now, it's possible, if you think about it carefully, every flow of benefits for some kind of persistent organism or persistent business, there are inputs that vary. So we've got suppose this is a factory and the number of workers could be anywhere from 0 to 100. It's possible to have not enough workers and you lose money. It's possible to have too many workers and you lose money. And there's some range in the middle where you can make a profit. And there is a place where you can have maximum profit. That's my signal to wrap it up. There's a place where you can have maximum profit. Every time then you plot the power of the benefits against the efficiency, you get a loop. And something really curious, if you read this loop, first of all, there's a link between time and efficiency. You can be fast but not efficient, and you can be efficient but not fast. And the maximum efficiency is right there, and the maximum power of preservation is right there. Now, there was an economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, in 1965, talked about the theory of the firm, and he said, although most economists think that the goal of a firm is to maximize the return to the shareholders, that would be maximum possible efficiency, he said they usually function to operate at maximum preservation of useful money. In this case, it's called retained earnings. They maximize the retained earnings so that they can put it into growing their market share, growing the size of the firm, breaking into new markets, that sort of thing. So the maximum power principle is talking about that sort of thing. What's the difference between Lotka and Odom? Lotka is talking about pathways, and Odom is talking about energy transformations. Okay, I'm going to jump forward to one slide. Because the maximum power principle, as I've described it, is choosing those things that are going to consume the most energy the most quickly. This is the tree of great alternative economic theories. And you see the green one in there, that's green investments, and that's where I put my money a few years ago. Teleological pruning, that means pruning of your plans and purposes. Economic theories that align with the effects of the MPP will persist. Those that do not align with the effects of the MPP, those that are not steering us towards maximum consumption, maximum consumerism, maximum extraction of resources, will be pruned away. And there they go, all those orthodox theories, or heterodox theories, and there go my green investments. Okay, I'm going to jump through this. My last speculative observation, natural selection uses power as fitness criteria to preserve or destroy complexity. We need a new economic paradigm, a new story in our heads, compatible with the coming realities of the future. Thank you.
All right. Anybody able to phrase a question based upon this philosophical talk? Oh, it's a stymied audience. A stymied audience.
Somebody surely wants to say, you're wrong, wrong, wrong.
Just quickly, by the way you treated the Canadian dollar and fiat money, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the present economic situation and monetary situation?
I am pessimistic that the kind of change that needs to happen will happen without a crisis, personally. I think we are headed for difficult times, and I think if we don't figure out how to deal with that while we still have the ability to figure that out, we will not have the ability to figure it out later. So I think we should be I think we should be putting as much effort as we can into understanding what is really happening with the world around us. What are the forces that are dragging our civilization towards the volcano and about to toss it in? Can we figure it out quickly enough to prevent that, to change our direction? I'm a positive person, but I'm pessimistic about that particular aspect of life.
It's very
Following
Canadian.
up on that question, you are a Canadian. In the financial crisis, Canada was the only country which did not suffer severely like the rest of the world because you had a decent banking system. Is that part of the way you think?
Our banks really, really wanted to be big boys like the banks in the rest of the world, and we told them, no, you can't be, and that saved us. So I think banking regulation is a part of the solution, as perhaps might have been clear by my model. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and unfortunately I came in late. But are you an economist or an engineer?
I'm a retired computer programmer.
Okay.
I'm a high school teacher.
Forget that part. Computer, because half the people walked out of here, right? 5, I'm exaggerating. 5 people walked out. The engineers were just bored. They couldn't take economics. I was absolutely fascinated to come in here, and we're going to talk about money. But thank you. It was a brilliant talk. Keep it up.
Well, thank
Get out
you.
of high school. Get into a university.
Wait for the mic, please.
I thought it was interesting that you started out critiquing the neoclassicals, and the early neoclassicals used a lot of physics to construct their models. They wanted very much to be considered more scientific, to get rid of a lot of words and use a lot of equations. And then you used a lot of physics, which frankly was lost on me because I'm an economist. Not a physicist. And so I thought it was interesting, though, you're challenging them, but you're using many of the same tools that they've used in the past. And I didn't know if you had a comment.
The classical economists were struggling very hard to bring science into their studies. It is my understanding, I haven't been able to actually find the historical texts that reference it, but there was essentially a purge in all the universities managed by Rockefeller and Carnegie and those boys. They wanted economic theory to tell them that what they were doing was the right thing. So anybody who had a science base got tossed out of the universities. Now, it could be an apocryphal story, I don't know, but it makes sense to me. Certainly science disappeared from economic theory around 1900. And many of the ideas of the classical economists are being revisited again. All of these heterodox economics groups are revisiting those ideas and trying to figure out which ones are good and which ones are bad.
But many of the models that early on were very rationalist-based and were based on mathematical models. They weren't really, the model was what, there's a famous joke for economists. You have one graph that says, we can explain it really well, we can't explain it very well. It happens all the time, it never happens. And neoclassical economics for micro was always way over in the quadrant where it was never happens, but we can explain it really, really well. And so
I like that one.
I could draw it for you afterwards. So that was, I mean, having come through that system of been educated in that, you learn a lot of highly mathematical models based on constrained maximization. And whether or not they actually explain reality, you're right, that was not really the point.
I go back to my assumption that I put at the beginning. We live in one reality, and surely the same forces that are shaping our physical life must be acting to shape our social and economic life. And if that is the paradigm, if that is the story that we have in our head, then we can look at all these things have been discussed before. I don't think there's anything that I put up here that somebody hasn't said. I've just taken the pieces of the puzzle and dropped them into different boxes, and I'm showing you the boxes that I've dropped them in. So there's nothing new here. It's just rearranging things to try to see it differently. I don't like things that are elegantly mathematical because they're addictive. But I think mathematics is necessary to understand the nature of the forces that are shaping our world.
For any of the students in the room, if you're interested in economics, there's a whole other field that's come up that's been bringing together economics and psychology called behavioral economics, and that's getting a lot more traction in the field. For a long time, it was just poo-pooed that you could explain all human interaction by just a constrained maximization model, and now the psychologists are, chomping at the bit to get their hands on some of it. But it's very big in business too, human resource management, how we make decisions, and so the psychologists have started bleeding over into the economic sphere, whether we want them to or not.
Yeah, behavioral economics was the fifth one on my list, but because I've never read about it, I thought I better not say something about something I haven't read about. But it's certainly a science-based approach. Yeah.
Well, thanks for those comments. Maybe I'll finish up with one here. In your last couple of slides here, you threw out MPP again, I think, without people remembering exactly what that was, maximum power principle of Odom, and essentially trend.
Oh, but Pinkerton.
At least the phrasing from Odom. And said NCE is the only thing, or neoclassical economics is the only thing left on the tree. Can you expand upon why neoclassical economics is the only thing left on your pruned tree?
Neoclassical economics, by any way you measure it, is not based on science. It's a quasi-religion, pseudoscientific. There's lots of wonderful mathematics in it, and the arguments are all very cohesive and very convincing. But it's not based on a scientific method. It cannot be verified. It cannot be falsified. All those things that Kuhn was worried about way back in the 50s and 60s, they just don't apply to economic theory. But what NCE has going for it is that it encourages all the leaders of the world and all the corporate leaders and all the people working in those organizations to believe that perpetual growth is our only salvation. So because all of the other heterodox theories are saying, what? Where did this come from? They're going off in other directions, trying to figure out, well, what are the dynamics of an economy really about? But neoclassical economics is training us to extract as much and burn it up as quickly as possible in a slow burn mechanism. Not too fast, not too slow, but a slow burn so that we get as much as possible and burn it off. That's why the others fall away. That's why my green investments died. That's why NCE persists, in spite of the fact that most scientists, if they give it any thought at all, can't believe that this is really the way we're running the world. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so you said that the same principle that governs physical world should in principle like govern the economic and social world, right?
Yes.
So the thing is, in physical world, so if there's water is H2O here, in Saudi Arabia also it's H2O, but in like India also it's H2O. But if you see the social behavior of people, it changes like from region to region based on their religious beliefs and all. So how do you say exactly it's the same principles that should work in the social world?
I have not studied all the cultures of the world. I am a high school teacher that since retirement I sit in my basement thinking and typing on my computer. So I can't answer that based on any real information that I have. I can take a guess at what the answer is. I can guess that in each circumstance there is a culture that is consumption oriented. And if other subcultures start to diverge from that, if they are less oriented towards consumption, they will draw fewer participants and they will stay small and ineffective and maybe disappear. That's just a guess based on me thinking about it. So I can't say that's the way it is in India. It certainly is the way it is in all the businesses that I have advised or with which I have participated in some fashion. This vision that I have of how things work is congruent with my limited experience. But I still believe it.
Right. That's a good question.
It was a good question.
So it's a good question. You know, are more countries and economies going towards what roughly we have in the United States in a market consumption-based economy, or are we becoming more like economies that are not so fixated on consumption and growth? I think it's more the former. The other thing I think, at least on that question, is that the same mathematical principles that govern the distribution of gas molecules in a room somehow seem to describe the distribution of income and wealth in at least consumption and market-based economies. So that's enough to make me interested in understanding what in the world is going on. So let's thank Garvin for a great and insightful talk.
My pleasure. Anybody want to?
I think it's 15, 60 or something.
Oh, I get